Hello, welcome to Culture Hash. Got a new album for you guys today. Rick Ross, Port of Miami, Duh. So Rick Ross is a gangster rapper from Miami, Florida, and what Rick Ross specializes in are fantastical gangster narratives, just like transporting drugs all across America, flooding the streets with cocaine. That's what Rick Ross does in his music. All rappers tend to exaggerate, you know. I'm sure Jay-Z wasn't just like running all the drugs coming in and out of New York in the 1990s. But Rick Ross took it to new extremes, and this like grandiose Scarface level of exaggeration has become Rick Ross's calling card over his career. These fabricated gangster tales were a bit more realistic on his debut album, Port of Miami. This project came out at a beautiful time, 2006, and it bears all the hallmarks of an album from the mid-2000s. We've got appearances by the likes of Akon and Mario Winans. We've got a track with Lil Wayne and Briscoe, back when Lil Wayne was trying to push Briscoe on anyone who'd listen. Lil Wayne was in his prime, but this was before the drugs had completely rotted his brain and turned him into the drooling wreck you see now. What's most surprising about this track is that it was produced by DJ Khaled, back when DJ Khaled used to do stuff, before he was just shouting catchphrases and became a human meme. Rick Ross releases Port of Miami, he establishes his career, and 13 years of mediocre albums later, we get Port of Miami 2. So now, Rick Ross, he's 43. I think he's calmed down quite a bit because this feels like his most grounded and mature album to date. This isn't really saying much, but I feel like the fables have been toned down a little bit, and Rick Ross just sticks to realism, which in his case is just luxury raps about girls, cars, money, the usual stuff, the usual hedonism, very shallow raps on here. But there's a few moments where Rick Ross tries to get a bit more serious. I quite like the track I Still Pray, probably the most mature song I've actually heard from Rick Ross. And on this track, Rick Ross is vulnerable. He strips away a lot of that bravado and invincibility that he likes to portray in his raps. And on here, he talks about the emotive subject of how he almost died from a heart attack last year. On this track, I was quite surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Rick Ross raps like a bloody adult human being. He's not this superhero drug kingpin. He just talks about something that seriously happened to him, and it just makes him reconsider his life. I quite like Rick Ross's introspection on here. He talks about how he's written all these raps in his career, but he's never actually voted in his life. He says that he's got all this money around him, but it won't really stop him from dying alone. Rick Ross has had a few near-death experiences, and this is the first time we've heard him seriously address it. I remember in the early 2010s, Rick Ross had a couple of seizures. He addressed these on his 2012 album, God Forgives, I Don't, chalking it up to an in-flight blowjob gone wrong. And this is what I didn't like about Rick Ross at the time. It is just a very juvenile way of approaching a real-life subject. So I'm pleased to see some emotional development from Rick Ross on I Still Pray, talking about how this near-death experience actually affected him as a person and made him question some of his life decisions. So I Still Pray, I was impressed by the maturity on this track. It's the highlight of the album. For the rest of Port of Miami 2, Rick Ross is just overwhelmed by a succession of glitzy and glamorous beats that he probably has no business rapping over. Rick Ross has always been great at selecting his beats, but I've never liked his raps, and I still don't like him on here. And I've never liked Rick Ross's flow. It's very lethargic and lazy. It's got no energy, and he's on some of these fast-paced beats, and it just doesn't suit. It doesn't mesh even slightly. And even though his raps are a lot more realistic and true to his real life, I don't feel engaged by Rick Ross. I'm too busy listening to the beat while he just mumbles around in the background. I feel like Rick Ross wastes big time the Just Blaze beat. Just Blaze doesn't do too many beats these days, and it's got his trademark, signature, choppy horns, just real epic gospel feel to it. And Rick Ross is just so anonymous on here, complete waste of this beat. The same can be said for Act a Fool. Again, just brilliant horns here, completely wasted by Rick Ross. I like the closing track, Gold Roses, featuring Drake, but this one just feels like a Drake track with Rick Ross just slapped on at the end. Drake just does it all on here. He does a great opening verse, brilliant hook, and Rick Ross just comes in towards the end and he's anonymous again. And it's not like Rick Ross is offensively bad on here. I haven't got anything against the guy, but I just find him really mediocre. His flow is just what it is that just puts me off. It's just so boring and monotonous. The subject matter we've heard a million times before, just materialistic raps. Sometimes he gets a little bit political, like at the beginning of Vegas Residency. On here he criticises Kanye West for his Trump support, which is pretty decent, but again, Rick Ross doesn't command this great beat that he's been given. Rick Ross has always had a great ear for beats, but he's not really up to the standard that you want from someone to be rapping over these. Just that waste of a Just Blaze beat, it really pisses me off. Just Blaze doesn't come around too often, and you've got to just take over his beats and just command them. Rick Ross feels anonymous on this project. It's carried by the guests, carried by the beats. It's enjoyable to listen to, but mainly not because of Rick Ross. So all things considered, for me, Rick Ross, Port of Miami 2 is worthy of 4 out of 10. Every day I'm hustling, hustling,